I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was past midnight, and I was sitting in my car in an empty parking lot behind the 24-hour diner on Route 9. The engine was off, but I kept the keys in the ignition so the dashboard lights would stay on. That soft blue glow was the only thing keeping me company in the darkness. In my hands was a photograph I had pulled from the pages of an old paperback novel where I kept it hidden. The edges were worn soft from years of careful handling. Three faces smiled back at me from a summer that felt like a lifetime ago. There was Marcus in the center, his arm thrown casually around my shoulders, both of us tan and laughing at something just outside the frame. And there was Adrian on the other side, squinting slightly in the bright sunlight, that half smile he always wore when he was trying not to let on how much he was enjoying himself. My finger traced the outline of Adrian's face through the glossy surface. I had done this so many times that I worried I might wear away the image entirely. Marcus looked exactly as I remembered him from our college years together, but Adrian seemed different somehow every time I looked at this photo. Maybe it was because I was different each time I allowed myself to really see him. The photograph trembled in my hands, and I realized I was shaking. Not from the cold, though the October air had turned sharp enough to fog the windows. I was shaking because of what I was about to do. What I had been doing for weeks now, every Thursday night in this same parking lot. I pressed the photo carefully back between the pages of the novel and closed the book. The spine read East of Eden, though I had never made it past the first chapter. It served a different purpose now. I placed it on the passenger seat and closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing the way my therapist had taught me years ago. In through the nose, hold for 4 counts, out through the mouth. That was when my phone buzzed against the cup holder. The screen lit up with a message from Adrian. Same place as last week. The words glowed in the darkness of the car, simple and dangerous all at once. I stared at them until the screen went black again, then picked up the phone and read them again. On my left hand, my wedding ring caught the reflection of a streetlight. The gold band felt heavier than it had in years, as if the weight of everything it represented was finally pressing down on me. Evelyn had picked it out herself, careful and practical as she was with everything. We had been married for 8 years, but the last 3 had been nothing more than 2 people sharing the same address and the same carefully maintained silence. I typed and deleted a dozen different responses to Adrian's message. Yes seemed too eager. No seemed like a lie. Maybe seemed like I was playing games I had no business playing. The truth was that I had been thinking about last Thursday all week. About the way Adrian had looked at me when I finally worked up the courage to tell him that I thought about him more than I should. About the way he had not seemed surprised. The parking lot was empty except for my car and a lone pickup truck that had been there when I arrived. Through the diner windows, I could see a waitress reading a magazine behind the counter, waiting for customers who probably would not come. Everything about this moment felt suspended, as if the world was holding its breath while I decided what kind of person I was going to be. I thought about the man I used to be, the one who fell in love with Marcus during our junior year of college and believed that love could be simple if you just wanted it enough. I thought about the man I had tried to become, the one who married a good woman and taught high school English and lived the kind of life that looked right from the outside. And I thought about the man I might still become, the one who was brave enough to want what he actually wanted instead of what he thought he should want. My thumb hovered over the phone screen. Adrian was waiting for an answer, and I knew that whatever I typed back would change something fundamental about who I was. There would be no taking it back, no pretending this was just old friends catching up or reminiscing about better times. We both knew what we were really talking about, even if we had not said it out loud yet. I typed the word yes and pressed send before I could change my mind. The drive home from the diner took exactly 12 minutes, the same route I had taken every night for the past 8 years. Left onto Maple Street, right on a Birchwood Drive, third house on the left with the white picket fence that Evelyn had insisted we paint every spring. Even in the darkness, I could navigate these streets with my eyes closed. Everything about my life had become this predictable. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house that was supposed to represent everything I had worked toward. 2 stories, colonial style, with shutters the color of sage green and a front porch that we never used. Through the living room window, I could see the soft glow of the lamp Evelyn always left on for me. She would be asleep by now, curled on her side of the bed with her book folded open on the nightstand, marking her place for tomorrow. Inside, the house felt more like a museum than a home. Every surface was carefully curated, every photograph positioned to tell the story of a successful marriage and a life well lived. The mantel above the fireplace displayed our greatest hits in chronological order. Our wedding day, with Evelyn radiant in white, and me looking like I was trying to convince myself this was what happiness looked like. The day we brought our daughter home from the hospital, both of us exhausted but smiling. Emma's first steps, her first day of school, the family vacation to the beach where we all looked tan and content. Looking at those photographs now, I could see the exact moment when the smile started to look forced. It was gradual, like watching someone age in slow motion. By the time Emma turned 5, there was something strained around my eyes in every picture. By the time she turned 7, Evelyn and I had stopped touching each other even for the camera. I moved through the house quietly, following the same nighttime routine I had perfected over the years. Hang my keys on the hook by the door. Place my wallet and phone on the kitchen counter. Check that the back door is locked and the coffee pot is ready for tomorrow morning. These small rituals had once felt comforting, like evidence that I was a responsible adult who had his life together. Now they felt like the bars of a cage I had built around myself. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window overlooking our backyard. Evelyn had spent years cultivating a garden that was the envy of the neighborhood. Neat rows of perennials that bloomed in careful succession throughout the growing season. A small herb garden by the back steps. A maple tree we had planted the year Emma was born, now tall enough to shade half the yard. It was beautiful, and it was suffocating. I thought about the text I had sent to Adrian just an hour ago. That single word, yes, felt like the most honest thing I had said in months. Maybe years. The weight of it sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and solid and impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed against the counter. Adrian again. Thursday then. Same time. I stared at the words until they blurred, then deleted the conversation thread the way I always did. Evelyn had never asked to see my phone, but I had learned long ago that the safest secrets were the ones that left no trace. The morning came too soon, announced by the alarm clock that had been waking me at 6:15 every weekday for the past decade. Evelyn was already gone, probably at her yoga class or having coffee with one of her book club friends. She left a note on the kitchen table reminding me that Emma's science project was due Friday and asking if I could pick up milk on my way home. Her handwriting was neat and efficient, just like everything else about her. I drove to work through the same suburban streets, past the same strip malls and coffee shops and gas stations that had formed the backdrop of my adult life. The high school where I taught was a brick building from the 1960s, institutional and solid, with hallways that smelled like disinfectant and teenage anxiety. I had been teaching English there for 12 years, long enough to see multiple generations of the same families pass through my classroom. My colleagues knew me as reliable, reserved, someone who got along with everyone but never got too close to anyone. I arrived on time, stayed late to grade papers, volunteered for committees that no one else wanted to join. In the faculty lounge, I listened to other teachers complain about their marriages or brag about their children or plan their weekend adventures. I nodded and smiled and offered appropriate responses, but I never contributed much of my own. The truth was that I had very little to contribute. My life outside of school was a series of obligations and routines that I fulfilled without enthusiasm. Dinner with Evelyn, where we discussed Emma's schoolwork and the neighbor's new fence, and whether we needed to call someone about the strange noise the washing machine was making. Weekend errands and yard work and visits with Evelyn's parents, who still treated me like the son-in-law they had always wanted, even though I could see the questions forming behind their polite smiles. But Thursday nights were different. Thursday nights, I came alive. It started innocently enough, 3 weeks ago when I ran into Adrian at the bookstore downtown. I had been browsing the fiction section, looking for something to assign to my AP students, when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there he was, older than in the photograph I carried, but unmistakably himself. The same dark hair, though shorter now. The same eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. We talked for 20 minutes in the poetry section, catching up on the years that had passed since Marcus and I broke up and I disappeared into marriage. Adrian told me he was working as a freelance graphic designer, that he had never married, that he still thought about our old group of friends sometimes. He asked careful questions about my life, and I gave careful answers that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. When he suggested we get coffee sometime, I should have said no. When he texted me later that week asking if I wanted to take a walk around the lake, I should have deleted the message. When he looked at me during that first walk with something that felt like recognition, I should have run. Instead, I had said yes. And then yes again. And again. Now, standing in my empty classroom after the final bell had rung, I thought about how much my life had changed in just 3 weeks. On the surface, nothing was different. I still woke up in the same bed, ate breakfast at the same table, taught the same classes to teenagers who were more interested in their phones than in Shakespeare. But underneath, everything had shifted. There was a current of anticipation running through my days now, a sense that I was moving towards something instead of just marking time. I thought about Adrian's message from the night before. Thursday then. Same time. Tomorrow night, I would drive back to that parking lot behind the diner. Tomorrow night, I would have to decide again who I wanted to be. I need to tell you about that afternoon at the bookstore 3 weeks ago, because that was when everything started to unravel. Or maybe when it started to make sense. I am still not sure which. It was a Saturday in late September, one of those perfect autumn days when the air is crisp but the sun is still warm enough to make you forget that winter is coming. Evelyn had taken Emma to her mother's house for the weekend, some grandmother-granddaughter bonding time that I was not invited to join. I should have felt lonely, but instead I felt something I had not experienced in years. Freedom. I drove downtown to the independent bookstore on Main Street, the one with the narrow aisles and the cat that sleeps in the window display. I told myself I was looking for something new to assign to my advanced placement students. Maybe a contemporary novel that would challenge them without sending their parents to the principal's office with complaints. But really, I just wanted to be somewhere that felt different from my usual orbit of home and school and grocery store. The fiction section was tucked away in the back corner, past the bestsellers and the local authors display. I was scanning the spines of books I had read in graduate school, wondering if any of them would speak to 17-year-olds the way they once spoke to me, when I heard someone say my name. Not my full name, Julian, but the nickname that only a handful of people had ever used, Jules. I turned around, and there was Adrian, standing 3 feet away with a book of poetry in his hands. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. He looked the same, but different, the way people do when you have not seen them for years, but they have been living their life the whole time you were living yours. His hair was shorter, more professional. There were lines around his eyes that had not been there when we were 22. But his smile was exactly the same, that half-crooked grin that had always made me feel like I was in on some secret joke. "Hey," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it. Warm and a little rough around the edges, like he had just woken up. "I thought that was you." The book in my hands suddenly felt heavy. I realized I was holding The Great Gatsby, probably the most cliched choice possible for a high school English teacher. I set it back on the shelf and tried to compose myself. "Adrian," I said, "what are you doing here?" "Same thing as you, I think." He held up the poetry collection, something by a writer I did not recognize. "Looking for something good to read. I live about 10 minutes from here now." The conversation that followed was careful and polite, the kind of small talk that people make when they are testing the waters of a relationship that ended badly. He told me he had moved back to the area 2 years ago for work, that he was doing freelance design for small businesses and nonprofits. I told him about teaching, about Emma, about the house on Birchwood Drive. Neither of us mentioned Marcus, though his absence from the conversation felt like a presence all its own. But underneath the politeness, there was something else. A current of recognition that made my skin feel too tight. Adrian kept looking at me the way he used to look at me across the dinner table when Marcus was telling one of his long stories about work or school, like he was seeing something that nobody else could see. We moved through the store together, not quite walking side by side, but not apart either. He showed me a book about sustainable architecture that he thought I might find interesting. I recommended a novel about a teacher in a small town that I thought he might like. The conversations were surface level, but there was an intimacy to them that felt dangerous. When we reached the coffee shop section of the store, Adrian stopped walking. "You know," he said, and then paused like he was reconsidering whatever he was about to say. "I always wondered what happened to you. After you and Marcus broke up, you just disappeared." I felt heat rise up my neck. Marcus and I had ended things during our senior year of college. Not badly, but not well either. We had been growing apart for months, maybe longer, but neither of us wanted to admit it. When I finally worked up the courage to say that I thought we wanted different things, Marcus had been relieved. But Adrian had been Marcus's best friend, and I had assumed that meant choosing sides. "I got married," I said, which was true, but not the whole truth. I needed to figure out who I was supposed to be. Adrian nodded like this made perfect sense to him. "But did you?" he asked. "Figure it out, I mean." The question hung in the air between us like smoke. Around us, other customers browsed the shelves, and the espresso machine hissed, and life continued as normal. But I felt like something fundamental had shifted in the universe. "I am still working on it," I said finally. Adrian smiled then, that same crooked grin, but softer somehow. "Would you want to get coffee sometime?" he asked, "just to catch up properly. I mean, it has been what, 8 years?" 9, I said before I could stop myself. It has been 9 years. The fact that I knew exactly how long it had been seemed to surprise both of us. Adrian's expression changed, became more serious, more intent, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. 9 years, he repeated. That is a long time to go without talking to an old friend. I bought the book of poetry that Adrian had been holding when I first saw him. I am not sure why. Maybe because I wanted something to remember this moment by. Maybe because I wanted an excuse to think about him later. He bought a cookbook about Mediterranean food and made a joke about trying to become a better adult. We stood outside the bookstore for another 10 minutes, neither of us quite ready to end the conversation. The afternoon light was golden and warm, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When he asked for my phone number, I gave it to him without hesitation. When he said he would text me about coffee, I said I would like that. When he walked away toward his car, I watched until he disappeared around the corner. That night, I sat in my empty house and read the poetry book from cover to cover. It was about longing and loss and the spaces between what we want and what we allow ourselves to have. Every poem felt like it had been written specifically for me. Adrian texted me the next morning. "Thank you for yesterday. It was good to see you again. Really good." I stared at those words for a long time before I responded. For me too. But what I wanted to write was that I had not stopped thinking about him since the moment I saw him in the bookstore. That I had dreamed about him the night before for the first time in years. That something had woken up in me that I thought I had buried so deep it could never be found again. Instead, I wrote back asking if he wanted to meet for coffee on Thursday evening. He said yes immediately. That was how it started. Not with grand gestures or declarations of love, but with a simple invitation to remember who we used to be to each other, and maybe to discover who we could become. Thursday came too slowly and too quickly all at once. I spent the week distracted in ways that felt both familiar and completely foreign. During faculty meetings, I found myself checking my phone more often than usual. While grading papers, I caught my mind wandering to conversations I wanted to have, things I wanted to tell Adrian about my students, about the books I was teaching, about the small observations that usually had no one to share them with. Evelyn noticed, of course. She had always been perceptive about changes in routine, in mood, in the careful equilibrium we had maintained for so many years. "You seem different this week," she said on Wednesday night as we cleaned up after dinner. "More distracted than usual." I told her I was thinking about changing up my curriculum, maybe adding some contemporary authors to the reading list. It was not entirely a lie. Adrian's question about whether I had figured out who I was supposed to be had made me think about what I was teaching my students about literature, about life, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of our choices. She nodded and went back to loading the dishwasher, but I could feel her watching me more carefully after that. Evelyn had always been good at sensing when something was shifting, even if she could not name what it was. The coffee shop Adrian had suggested was downtown, in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture. It was the kind of place I never went to anymore, the kind of place that reminded me of college, of late nights spent talking about books and music and the people we thought we might become. When I walked in at 6 o'clock, Adrian was already there, sitting at a small table by the window with 2 cups in front of him. He had remembered how I take my coffee. Black, no sugar. Such a small thing, but it felt enormous. We talked for 2 hours, and it was like finding a language I had forgotten I knew. Adrian asked about my teaching, and I found myself telling him things I had never said out loud before. How lonely it could be to care about literature in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to it. How frustrated I got with students who saw reading as a chore instead of a doorway. How sometimes I felt like I was failing them by not being able to communicate why these stories mattered. He listened in a way that felt complete, asking questions that showed he was really hearing what I was saying. When I asked about his design work, he talked about helping small businesses figure out how to tell their stories visually, how to communicate their values through color and shape and space. There was a passion in his voice that I envied, a sense that his work was connected to something larger than himself. But it was not just what we talked about. It was the way we talked. The silences felt comfortable instead of awkward. When our hands both reached for the sugar dispenser at the same time, and our fingers brushed, neither of us pulled away immediately. When he laughed at something I said, really laughed, it felt like a gift I had not known I was hoping for. As we were getting ready to leave, Adrian asked if I wanted to walk around the lake. It was only 7:30, still light enough to see the path clearly. I should have said no. I should have gone home to help Emma with her homework and ask Evelyn about her day and maintain the careful fiction that nothing in my life was changing. Instead, I said yes. The lake was a 20-minute drive from downtown, a small body of water surrounded by a walking trail that local families used for exercise and dog walking. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting everything in that golden light that makes even ordinary moments feel significant. We walked slowly, in no hurry to complete the circuit. Adrian told me about the apartment he was renting, a loft space above a bookstore that came with 2 cats he had not asked for but had grown attached to. I told him about Emma, how proud I was of her intelligence and her curiosity, how sometimes I worried that I was not a good enough father because I felt so disconnected from everything else in my life. That was when he stopped walking and looked at me directly. "You know," he said, "I always thought you were the most present person I knew. When we were in college, you were the one who really listened when people talked. You were the one who remembered the small things that mattered to people." I had never thought of myself that way, but hearing him say it, I could almost see the person he was describing. Someone who paid attention, who cared about the details of other people's lives. Someone who had maybe gotten lost somewhere along the way. We were standing at the edge of the water now, watching the last light reflect off the surface. Adrian was close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woody and subtle that I did not remember from college. Close enough that when he spoke, I could feel the warmth of his breath. "I missed talking to you," he said quietly. "I missed having someone who understood the things I cared about." The honesty of it took my breath away. I had spent so many years having careful conversations, saying the right things, maintaining the appropriate distance from anything that felt too real. But Adrian was looking at me like he could see straight through all of that to something true underneath. "I missed you too," I said, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew they were more honest than anything I had said in years. That night, driving home, I felt like I was vibrating at a different frequency than usual. Everything looked sharper, more vivid. The familiar streets of my neighborhood seemed like a stage set for someone else's life. Evelyn was already asleep when I got home, but she had left the hallway light on for me. I stood in our bedroom doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep, trying to remember the last time I had felt anything approaching desire when I looked at her. She was beautiful still, objectively, kind and intelligent, and everything a reasonable person should want in a partner. But standing there, I felt like I was looking at her through glass. Adrian texted me the next morning. "Thank you for last night. Would you want to do it again sometime?" I wrote back yes before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. That became our pattern. Every Thursday, we would meet somewhere different. Sometimes coffee, sometimes dinner at quiet restaurants on the edge of town, sometimes long walks through neighborhoods I had never explored. We never called them dates, never acknowledged what they were becoming, but there was an intimacy to them that felt more real than anything else in my life. Adrian had a way of asking questions that made me remember who I used to be. What did I love about teaching when I first started? What books had changed my life? What did I think about when I could not sleep at night? I found myself telling him things I had never told anyone, thoughts and fears and dreams that had been locked away for so long I had almost forgotten they existed. He told me about his own struggles, the difficulty of building a creative career that paid the bills, the loneliness of working alone, the way he sometimes felt like he was pretending to be an adult while everyone else seemed to have figured it out naturally. He talked about Marcus sometimes, carefully, old stories from college that reminded us both of the person we used to be when we were young and believed that love was simple. But there were moments when the careful boundaries we had established began to blur. The way he would touch my arm when he was making a point. The way I found myself studying his face when he was not looking, memorizing the changes that 9 years had brought. The way we both lingered in parking lots after our evenings together, neither quite ready to say goodbye. 3 weeks into our Thursday meetings, something shifted. We were sitting in his car after dinner, talking about a book I had mentioned wanting to read, when he reached across the console to retrieve it from his glove compartment. He had bought it for me, he said, just because he thought I would like it. The gesture was so thoughtful, so intimate, that I could not speak for a moment. When I finally looked up from the book to thank him, he was watching me with an expression I had not seen since college. Not the careful friendship we had been maintaining, but something deeper and more dangerous. We sat in silence for a long moment, the air in the car feeling thick with everything we were not saying. Then Adrian reached out and touched my hand where it rested on the book, just a brief brush of his fingers against mine. I should have pulled away. I should have remembered my wedding ring, my daughter, the life I had built that depended on me being someone other than who I was in that moment. Instead, I turned my hand over and let our fingers intertwine. Neither of us said anything. We just sat there in the darkness of the parking lot, holding hands like teenagers, and I felt more awake than I had in years. When I finally drove home that night, I could still feel the warmth of his touch. I knew that something irreversible had begun. The week after we held hands in his car, everything felt different. Not just between Adrian and me, but in the way I moved through my daily life. It was like someone had adjusted the color saturation on a television screen. The same images, but suddenly more vivid, more real. I caught myself smiling at odd moments. While teaching Hamlet to my third period class, explaining Polonius's advice to Laertes about being true to oneself, I thought about Adrian's fingers intertwined with mine and had to pause mid-sentence. During dinner with Evelyn and Emma, when my daughter was telling us about her science project on photosynthesis, I found myself thinking about how Adrian's eyes crinkled when he laughed, and I realized I had been quiet too long when they both stopped talking and looked at me expectantly. Evelyn's scrutiny intensified. She asked more questions about my evenings out, though I had been careful to call them faculty meetings or curriculum planning sessions. She commented on my mood, my energy, the way I hummed while making coffee in the morning. I told her I was feeling inspired by some new approaches to teaching, which was not entirely untrue. Adrian had given me a way of seeing my own life that felt like inspiration, even if it was not the kind I could explain to my wife. Thursday could not come fast enough. When it finally arrived, Adrian suggested we skip dinner and go straight to the lake. There was something different in his voice when he texted, something more urgent. I told Evelyn I would be late, another meeting about the spring curriculum, and drove to meet him with my heart beating faster than it should have been. He was waiting in the parking lot when I arrived, leaning against his car with his hands in his pockets. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself like he was bracing for something difficult. We started walking without much conversation, following the familiar path around the water. The October evening was crisp and clear, the kind of night that makes you want to walk forever. But there was an electricity in the air between us that had not been there before, a sense that we were moving towards something that neither of us had quite named yet. About halfway around the lake, Adrian stopped walking and turned to face me. The sun had set completely by then, and the only light came from the scattered lampposts along the path. In the soft glow, his face looked serious, almost grave. "Julian," he said, and the way he said my full name made my stomach clench with anticipation. "I need to tell you something." I waited, not trusting myself to speak. "I have been thinking about last week," he continued. "About what happened in the car. About what this is becoming." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the water. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more vulnerable than I had ever heard it. "I do not want to complicate your life," he said. "I know you have a family, responsibilities. I know this is not simple for you." But then he looked at me directly, and I could see something raw and honest in his expression. "But I also cannot pretend anymore that I do not feel something for you. Something that goes way back, maybe even to college when I was too scared to admit it to myself." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were unexpected, but because they gave voice to something I had been feeling but could not allow myself to acknowledge. The current that had been running between us all these weeks suddenly felt like a river that could sweep away everything in its path. "Adrian," I started to say, but he held up a hand to stop me. "I am not asking you for anything," he said. "I just needed you to know, so that whatever we decide to do from here, we are both being honest about what this is." We resumed walking, but the silence between us was different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. When we reached the bench where we sometimes sat to watch the water, Adrian stopped again. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "Do you ever think about the person you might have been if you had made different choices?" The question was so close to thoughts I had been having that it took my breath away. Of course I did. I thought about it every day now. Every time I looked at Adrian and felt something in my chest that I had convinced myself I was not capable of feeling anymore. "All the time," I said quietly. Adrian moved closer to me on the bench, close enough that our knees were almost touching. The space between us felt like the most important distance in the world. "I think about it too," he said. "I think about what might have happened if I had been braver when we were younger. If I had told you how I felt instead of watching you be with Marcus and pretending I was happy for you both." The confession hung in the air between us like smoke. I could see him gathering courage for something, and I knew with absolute certainty what was about to happen. I could have stopped it. I could have stood up, made some excuse, driven home to my safe and suffocating life. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. When Adrian leaned toward me, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When his hand touched my face, gentle and sure, I closed my eyes and let myself fall into the moment I had been both dreading and hoping for. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like he was giving me a chance to change my mind. But when I kissed him back, when I let my hand find the back of his neck and pull him closer, something broke open in both of us. The world went completely still. There was no lake, no park, no life waiting for me at home. There was only Adrian's mouth against mine, the taste of him, the way he made a small sound of surprise and relief when I deepened the kiss. My hands were shaking, actually trembling, like my entire nervous system was trying to process too much sensation at once. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Adrian rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel his breath warm against my face. "I have wanted to do that for so long," he whispered. The honesty of it, the raw vulnerability in his voice, made something crack open in my chest. Because I realized in that moment that this was not just about wanting Adrian, though I did want him with an intensity that scared me. This was about recognizing something in myself that I had been trying to bury for years. Marcus had been practice, I understood suddenly. A safe way to explore one part of myself while keeping the rest locked away. But Adrian was the real thing. The person who saw all of me and wanted all of me, not just the parts that were easy to love. The terror was immediate and overwhelming. Adrian had been Marcus's best friend. The betrayal implicit in what we had just done felt like a weight on my chest. And my marriage, my daughter, The entire structure of my adult life suddenly felt as fragile as glass. But underneath the fear was something else. Relief so profound it made me dizzy. The relief of finally being honest about who I was and what I wanted. I should go, I said, but I made no move to leave. Adrian nodded, but his hand was still touching my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. I know, he said, but Julian. Yes, I am not sorry. For any of it. Looking at him in the lamplight, his hair messed from my fingers, his eyes soft and serious and full of something that looked like love, I realized that I was not sorry either. Terrified, yes. Guilty, absolutely. But not sorry. I drove home that night with the taste of him still on my lips, knowing that everything had changed and that there was no going back to who I had been before he kissed me. For better or worse, I was finally awake. The kiss changed everything, but for 3 days I pretended it had changed nothing. I went through the motions of my regular life with the desperate precision of someone trying to hold together something that was already falling apart. I taught my classes, graded papers, made dinner conversation with Evelyn about ordinary things. But underneath it all, I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. Adrian texted me once, just a simple message saying he hoped I was okay. I stared at it for 20 minutes before writing back that I was fine, which was such an obvious lie that I deleted it and wrote nothing at all. But I kept checking my phone, hoping for another message, hoping for some sign that what had happened between us was real and not just something I had imagined in a moment of temporary madness. Evelyn knew something was wrong. She had always been intuitive about changes in mood and energy, but now her attention felt like a spotlight I could not escape. She watched me during dinner, during the evening news, during the careful rituals we performed each night before bed. Her questions became more pointed, more direct. "You have been different lately," she said on Sunday night as we were getting ready for bed. "Distant. Like you were somewhere else even when you are here." I told her I was tired, stressed about work, worried about budget cuts that might affect my position. All true enough to sound convincing, but not the truth that mattered. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching me hang up my shirt in the closet we had shared for 8 years. "Julian," she said, and something in her voice made me turn around. "Is there someone else?" The question hung in the air between us like a blade. I could see in her face that she did not really want to know the answer, that she was hoping I would deny it convincingly enough that she could go back to pretending everything was fine. We had both become experts at that kind of willful blindness over the years. But standing there in our bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of the life we had built together, I found that I could not lie anymore. "Not completely. It is not what you think," I said finally. Evelyn's face went very still. "So there is someone." I sat down on my side of the bed, suddenly exhausted by the weight of everything I had been carrying. "Yes," I said quietly, "but it is not about them. It is about me, about who I am." She was quiet for a long time, processing what I had just admitted. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, controlled. "How long?" "A few weeks. But Evelyn, it is not about you. You have been a good wife, a good mother. This is about something that has been wrong with me for a long time." She laughed then, but there was no humor in it. "Something wrong with you?" "Julian, people do not just suddenly become different after 8 years of marriage. People do not just decide they are someone else." But that was exactly what had happened, I realized. Or maybe I had always been this person, and I was just finally admitting it to myself. "I am gay," I said, and hearing the words out loud felt like stepping off a cliff. "I think I always have been. I tried to be what you needed, what Emma needed, what everyone expected me to be. But I cannot do it anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn stared at me like I had just told her I was someone she had never met before. Which, in a way, I suppose I had. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Our daughter, Julian. Our life. Everything we have built together. I know," I said, and I meant it. "I know what this costs. I know what I am destroying. But I also knew that I could not keep living the lie we had been living. Not for her, not for Emma, not for anyone. The person I had been pretending to be was killing the person I actually was, and I could not do it anymore." Evelyn left the bedroom that night and slept in the guest room. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the conversation we would have to have about lawyers and custody and how to explain to Emma that her father was not who she thought he was. The next day, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years and drove to the lake. I needed to think, to figure out what came next, but mostly I just needed to be somewhere that felt real. The parking lot was empty except for an elderly man walking his dog, and I sat on the bench where Adrian had kissed me and tried to imagine a future that did not feel like a catastrophe. That was where I was when Adrian found me, 2 hours later. He said he had been worried when I did not respond to his text, that he had driven by my school and been told I was not there. Seeing him walk toward me across the grass, I felt something settle in my chest that I had not even realized was churning. He sat down beside me without saying anything, and we watched the water in silence for a few minutes. Finally, he asked if I was okay. I told Evelyn, I said, "About you." "About me?" Adrian went very still beside me. What did she say? That I was destroying our life. That I was abandoning my daughter. That people do not just become different after 8 years of marriage. I looked at him then, this man who had somehow become the catalyst for the most honest thing I had ever done. "But I am not becoming different," I said. "I am just finally admitting who I always was." Adrian reached for my hand, and I let him take it. We sat there holding hands in broad daylight, and I did not care who might see us. I was done hiding. "I cannot keep living like this," I told him. "Not with her, pretending to be someone I am not. Not with you hidden away like a secret I am ashamed of. I cannot keep betraying everyone, including myself." The words felt like a confession and a commitment all at once. Adrian squeezed my hand tighter. "What are you saying?" He asked quietly. "I am saying that I want to choose truth, even if it is messy and complicated and hurts people I care about. I am saying that I want to find out who I am when I am not pretending to be someone else." We talked for another hour, sitting by the water where everything had started to change. Adrian told me he would wait, that he would be patient while I figured out how to untangle my life. But I could see the hope in his eyes, and the fear too. He had been brave enough to show me who I really was, and now we both had to live with the consequences. When I drove home that evening, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Certainty. Not about what the future would look like, not about how we would navigate the complications of custody and divorce and starting over, but certainty about who I was and what I wanted. Evelyn was waiting for me in the kitchen when I got home. She had been crying, I could tell, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I called my sister," she said. "I am going to stay with her for a few days. With Emma. I think we both need some time to figure out what this means." I nodded. That seemed reasonable, necessary even. "But Julian," she said as she picked up her purse from the counter, "I need you to understand something. I am not going to make this easy for you. You do not get to blow up our family and then expect me to help you feel good about it." I knew she was right. I knew that choosing honesty did not absolve me of the pain I was causing, the promises I was breaking. But I also knew that I could not go back to pretending, even if that would have been easier for everyone. After she left with Emma, I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like home and thought about the choice I was making. It was not clean or noble or simple. It was messy and selfish and would hurt people I loved. But it was also true, and I had spent too many years living a lie to go back to it now. I was 41 years old, and I was finally choosing to be myself. 3 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Evelyn and Emma stayed with her sister, and I lived alone in the house that had been our home for 8 years. The silence was profound and unsettling. I had forgotten how much space 2 other people could take up, not just physically, but in all the small sounds and routines that make a house feel alive. Without them, the rooms felt like a museum of someone else's life. I met with a lawyer, a kind woman who specialized in what she called amicable separations. She explained custody arrangements and asset division with the gentle efficiency of someone who had guided many people through the dissolution of their carefully constructed lives. I signed papers and wrote checks, and tried to feel something other than the strange numbness that had settled over everything. Adrian and I continued to meet, but carefully now, with the weight of what we were building pressing down on every conversation. We did not kiss again, not yet. Instead, we talked about practical things. where I might live when the house sold, how to tell Emma the truth in a way that would not make her feel like my choices were her fault, how to navigate the complicated reality of loving someone who had been part of the life I was leaving behind. He was patient in a way that made my chest ache. When I spiraled into guilt about Emma, about the years Evelyn and I had lost trying to make something work that was never going to work, Adrian listened without trying to fix it or make me feel better. He just witnessed it, the way he had always witnessed me, with complete attention and acceptance. The morning I finally left came without ceremony. I woke up before dawn on a Tuesday in November, the house dark and cold around me. I had been sleeping badly for weeks, my dreams full of airports and missed flights and doors that would not open no matter how hard I pushed against them. But that morning, I felt clear for the first time in months. I moved quietly through the rooms, gathering the few things that felt essential. Some books, mostly poetry and novels I had loved before I learned to be practical about everything. A photograph of Emma from her last birthday, laughing at something just outside the frame. The coffee mug my students had given me the year before, with a quote from Thoreau about living deliberately printed in fading letters. Everything else felt like it belonged to someone else, to the version of myself I was finally ready to stop being. In the kitchen, I made coffee one last time using the machine Evelyn and I had received as a wedding gift. I stood at the window overlooking her garden, now brown and dormant in the November cold, and thought about all the mornings I had stood in this same spot feeling like I was disappearing a little more each day. When I finished the coffee, I placed my wedding ring carefully on the counter next to the sink. The gold band looked so small sitting there, such an ordinary object to have carried the weight of so many years and so many compromises. I did not feel anger toward it, or toward the promises it represented. Just a quiet sadness for the young man who had put it on believing that love was something you could will yourself into feeling. I left a note for Evelyn, brief and honest. I told her I was sorry for the pain I had caused, but not sorry for finally choosing truth. I told her she deserved someone who could love her completely, the way she had always deserved to be loved. I told her I would do everything I could to be a good father to Emma, even if I could not be the husband she had needed me to be. The drive to meet Adrian took me through streets I had traveled thousands of times, but everything looked different in the gray light before sunrise. Sharper somehow, more real, like I was seeing the world clearly for the first time in years. He was waiting at the edge of town, in the parking lot of a diner that served truckers and insomniacs, and people like us who found themselves awake at odd hours. His car was running, exhaust visible in the cold air, and when he saw me pull up beside him, he turned off the engine and got out. We did not speak at first. There was nothing that needed to be said, nothing that could capture the enormity of what was happening. Instead, Adrian opened the passenger door of my car and got in, settling beside me like he belonged there, like he had always belonged there. We sat in silence as the sun began to rise, light spilling slowly across the dashboard and warming our faces. I could hear the distant sound of traffic picking up on the highway, the world waking up around us. Somewhere, Evelyn was probably making coffee in her sister's kitchen, trying to explain to Emma why Daddy was not coming home. Somewhere, my students were getting ready for school, not knowing that their English teacher had finally learned something about living deliberately. But in that moment, none of it felt like failure or loss. It felt like the first honest moment of my adult life. My hand was resting on the console between us, palm up, fingers slightly curled. Without looking at me, without any hesitation, Adrian reached out and threaded his fingers through mine. His hand was warm and familiar, like something I had been missing without knowing it. We did not talk about what came next. We did not make promises or declarations or plans. There would be time for all of that later, time to figure out how to build something real and sustainable from the wreckage of what came before. Time to navigate the complicated reality of custody schedules and new apartments and telling people who we really were. But for now, there was just this. Two men sitting in a car as the sun came up, holding hands like teenagers, finally brave enough to want what they actually wanted. Finally free to love without apology or explanation or shame. It was not the end of the story, I knew. In many ways, it was just the beginning. But it was enough. It was honest. It was real. It was, at last, the truth.